Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Todd. Thank you for joining me today. And on today's episode, I want to address the question of why do we hurt? What is it about some of the experiences that we have had in life that just don't seem to heal on their own? And instead, we seem to carry some of those emotional scars and they affect us even years or decades later. What is really being affected there, and how do we understand where that pain is coming from so that we can try to heal from those wounds? So, let's get started. So when I started out of my healing journey, one of the questions that I was really trying to understand is like, why am I hurting all the time? Why do I feel so bad about myself all the time? Why are my emotions just a complete disaster? You know, when it's like, when all of the stuff that happened to me was so long ago, why does that even matter anymore? What was it about me specifically that was affected by that? I mean, we know, right? We know that things that happen in childhood, right, affect us. And when we come into adulthood, we oftentimes carry a lot of that stuff with us, right? I mean, people talk about that all the time, right? I mean, that's not a mystery. But it's it's kind of the things that happened in childhood affect us, but affect us how? Affect us in what way? Because just simply saying, oh, well, it affected us and now I'm blah, 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 is only helpful to a certain degree, right? I mean, we can say, oh, well, I'm really sensitive to rejection because of what happened as a kid. But then what? I mean, it's like, yeah, that recognition can be helpful. But if we don't really have a framework for understanding what was affected, that is making us sensitive to rejection, for example, or abandonment, for example, or feeling excluded or feeling judged or whatever it is, right? Or even having our emotions just really dysregulated, where we can be perfectly fine, and all of a sudden it's just like, oh man, there's just like, we just have this feeling that either we have to run somewhere, or all of a sudden it's like, we have to change the direction in our life, and we have to do this instead, and I suddenly hate everything that I had been doing, and now I need to do something completely different, and emotional flashbacks, or actually visual flashbacks and nightmares and all of these kinds of things. It's like, why are we experiencing these things in the present for stuff that happened in the past? What is actually being affected? And so that's what I want to talk about, because I think that is a very, very important topic. And I think to start, it's important to understand that there are two basic kind of injuries that are relevant to our discussion. There are injuries that don't really need repair, that will just heal over time, right? And then there are injuries where if you don't repair those become lifelong disabilities, right? So for example, when we're growing up and we wipe out on our bike, we fall off our bike and we skin our leg and maybe sprain our wrist and all of that. I mean, those are things that you can kind of rub dirt on and walk them off kind of stuff, that over time, those things will heal on their own. And, 3 weeks later or a month later, we won't even remember that we had that stuff, right? And, things like someone stealing our bicycle, or, having our, having somebody steal our homework and things like that. I mean, it's like at the time, at the time they're certainly not fun. At the time we feel violated and we might feel hurt. We might feel angry and, somebody at school might call us a name or something like that, right? But over time, those kinds of things have the ability to heal on their own. And it's not like every single bad thing that ever happens to us, we have to go back and try to fix, right? And try to heal. Every time that, a friend, two friends decided they didn't want to be our friend anymore, right? Or whatever. I mean, it's not like those become lifelong scars, lifelong wounds that we, 50 years later, we sit there and pound our fists on the desk. And it's like, why did Jim and Bob suddenly not like me when I was 7, right? I mean, that kind of stuff just tends to go away on its own. There are other kinds of injuries, though, that are in a different class. And these are the injuries where, if they are not repaired, can lead to a lifetime of struggle. And so, using kind of the physical injury side, right? There's a difference between having a sprained ankle and a torn Achilles tendon. If you have a torn Achilles tendon, you need surgery. If you don't get surgery, then you will your walking will never be the same, right? I mean, you will be disabled. If you have a dislocated shoulder that is not repaired, or a torn, a severed tendon in your wrist, or you have a detached pec muscle, or there's a number of things that can happen. You have a deep cut, right, that requires stitches in order for that to heal correctly. If you don't get that treatment, right, if that repair doesn't happen, those injuries now are not something that just go away on their own. Your body might learn to adapt around them, right? But a severed tendon will never just magically reattach, right? A bone that has been broken and is not set will never just spontaneously go back to normal. And the same thing is true with some forms of emotional injury that we have, right? I mean, there's some forms of emotional injury that we can just recover from, and we can just roll our eyes. And, if we had people who said bad things about us, when we were in the Scouts, or, we had, there was an adult in our life that, was ornery and mean or whatever. I mean, a lot of those things we can recover from. But there are some forms of emotional damage that are equivalent to having a severed tendon, or having a ruptured Achilles tendon, or having a broken arm, right? That until they are healed, they will continue to cause pain, right? Until they are repaired, they cannot heal. And if they are not repaired, they will continue to cause a lot of emotional pain. And when we think about stuff that happened in our childhood that is still causing us pain, emotional pain in adulthood, or sensitivities where it's like, if we're really sensitive to abandonment, it's like somebody touching our broken arm. It's like, that was never healed properly. It's like, all of a sudden it hurts, right? Don't touch that. That's a sensitive area. That never healed, right? So it still is, it causes me pain all the time. There are times when I can put it out of my mind and not think about it, but anytime I try to do something with that arm, or somebody touches it or hits it, all of a sudden it's like, wow, man, I really am in a lot of pain right now. And a similar thing happens with our emotions, right? There are certain types of wounds that occur in childhood that you can't simply just rub dirt on them and walk them off, right? They don't go away on their own. And those injuries tend to revolve around 5 basic things, right? And in order to understand this, we have to understand a bit about emotion and why we even have emotion at all. Right? I mean, sometimes it seems like it would be easier if people weren't so, all this emotional stuff, all this emotional chaos and pain and anger and frustration and fear and all these things, anxiety and panic and stress. It's like, God, who needs it? Why can't we just chill and, just live our lives and kind of go through life without all of this angst and all of this other stuff. Well, the reason is that emotions serve one very, very important purpose, and that is survival. Emotions are intended to keep us alive. So most people have heard of the fight or flight response, right? So you're walking down the path and all of a sudden you hear a growl of an animal or you see a bear in the path. And what you feel is all of a sudden you feel this sinking feeling in your gut. You feel like you might puke. All of a sudden you feel this adrenaline through your system. You might get a little bit shaky. And all of your focus, it's like no matter what you were thinking about 2 seconds earlier, right? All of that clears out of your brain and everything is focused on the threat. And everything that you're thinking about is calculating, all right, what are they doing? What am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this? What do I, everything is all about survival. And that's what emotions do, right? Emotions do a couple of things, right? One is they get our physiology ready for some kind of threat, right? They get our body in the survival mode so that we can continue to exist after we get beyond this threat or try to cope with this threat in a way that will allow us to survive. And so this is one of the reasons why, when people are stressed, their gut might shut down, or when there's a lot of anxiety, they may have some GI stuff, they may have high blood pressure, they may feel a lot of tension in their muscles, all of that kind of stuff. It's because emotion is constantly preparing your body to deal with some kind of threat, whether the threat exists or not, right? But if our brain perceives it, right, and we have emotions that are being activated because of something that we perceive or something that is stuck on, like some kind of emotional activation that is stuck on from a wound, then one of the things that we'll notice is that our body will be affected by that. The other thing that emotions do is they direct our attention, right? Because if we go back to the walking through the forest, right? Walking through the woods and all of a sudden we hear a growl or we see a bear, right? It's like the only thing that matters for our survival is to focus on that very thing, right? Is to be able to just kind of put everything else out of our mind and just hyper-focus on that thing. And so emotions are very, very important in directing our attention, right? Which is one of the reasons why people who have emotional trauma, why they have, ADHD, right? Where they tend to be hyperactive because their body is always active and, they have a hard time concentrating on one thing because their focus is bouncing around because, these different emotional triggers are directing attention to try to cope with a threat that may no longer even exist. But the injury that we had, the threatening injury that we had in a previous life, earlier in life, that was not repaired, is still activating those emotions, and those emotions impact how we can focus. Sometimes we can't focus at all, or our mind is racing all the time, and we feel a knot in our gut, or sometimes we have trouble sleeping. We might have nightmares, all of these kinds of things. And emotions, when it comes to childhood experiences, right? There are 5 things that are really critical for every child to survive. We come into the world in a very, very immature state, shall we say. Unlike a horse who is born and within a few minutes could outrun most predators, human beings come out 100% dependent on their caregivers for survival. And so because of that, we as human beings are very, very attuned to 5 basic existential questions, right? The first one is, who am I, right? When you come into this world, it's like, who am I, and kind of where do I fit into the environment? Because that's going to be an important thing for me to kind of figure out how to navigate through this new environment that I'm in. Another one is, am I connected? Do I belong? Is there somebody else there with me? And the real question there is, am I alone? Because being alone historically oftentimes meant physical death within hours. A child who is abandoned wouldn't survive a day, right? Way back when there was wild animals and we were hunter-gatherers and all of that, which was the bulk of human experience. So young children, as they're growing up, are highly attuned to, is my parent here with me? Are they with me? And if they aren't, if I perceive that I'm alone, that can create a tremendous amount of distress. One of the reasons why babies cry when they're distressed, very, very young, why infants cry, is that they're signaling their distress to a parent. And when a parent comes to them and picks them up and comforts them, that helps to calm the infant's nervous system, because there's this message that when you are in danger, when you are in distress, I will be there for you. You are not alone. And what happens to children where parents ignore that, where they're just like, just let them cry it out, or they're off drinking, or they're too busy with their own lives to come and pay attention to you or comfort you. There are a couple things that happen. One is that a child starts to dissociate from their own emotions, where a lot of times it's like there's stress and there's anxiety in there, but it becomes generalized. I can't really identify where it's coming from, and that's a coping mechanism, right? When we have a need and we are communicating and we are afraid and we are trying to elicit somebody's responsiveness to be there for us, and they are not there, then there is a part of us who just internalizes this sense of, I have to take care of myself. Nobody is going to be there for me when I need help. I cannot trust that anyone will be there for me. Another of these 5 kind of existential questions or core self-concept needs is this need for safety. And this is that existential question of, am I safe? When we first come into this world, one of the things that we have to know is, for survival, is, am I in danger? Am I safe? And we are made to feel safe initially by being held, by being comforted, by parents being responsive. But as we grow up and we are facing challenges in our lives, we're a little kid and some big kid comes and threatens us, this big old lumbering parent, coming out and going, get away from my kid, right? Or standing up for us and setting some boundaries or being our advocate gives us this sense that we are safe and that we are okay. Being in an environment that is stable and predictable and calm makes us feel safe. Makes us feel comforted, like we don't need to worry about our own safety. Now, if you can imagine a very young child where the parents are screaming, or when the kid is being bullied at school, the parents are, oh, just go tough it up, or just go punch him in the nose, right? It's that would be suicide for a young kid. And, for a young kid, oftentimes it feels like, man, I have no backup. I feel very, very unsafe. And the fact that there is nobody here who is going to help me now all of a sudden just increases that lack of sense of safety. Now, if you put on top of that being molested or being raped or being attacked, being abused in some way, or having the parent who is supposed to be protecting you, who is supposed to be making you feel safe, now being hypercritical or judging and doing all of these kind of mean things towards ourselves or towards us, then there's a part of our sense of self, our self-concept, who needs that sense of safety that now doesn't feel safe. And that part of ourselves that needs that now is wounded, right? Because we need to have that from our parents. We need to have that from our environment. And when we don't, that can become a wound, much like a severed tendon, right, that we carry into adulthood. If you're finding this conversation helpful, I would invite you to jump over to my Substack and subscribe to my publication called the Effigism Letter. The Effigism Letter talks about effigism, of course, in more detail than I do on this channel, but also talks about topics of addiction and trauma, relationships, and all of the kind of the stuff that tends to be an issue for people who grew up in an effigistic home or who grew up in a home where there was emotional trauma, neglect, and things like that. So I think you'll find it interesting. It's free to sign up. Of course, there's a paid membership as well if you choose to do that. But even just going over and signing up for the free version, you'll learn a bit more than we talk about here on my YouTube channel. So hope to see you over there. There's another one of these 5 things, right? One of these 5 existential questions that is, do I matter, right? Because again, if we think about, a young child who is in a very vulnerable place, living in a very dangerous world, right? One of the first things they're going to want to know is not only, who am I? Am I alone? Am I safe? But it's also, do I matter? Do the people around me even see any value in me? Because if not, then I'm the one who could get left out. I'm the one who could get rejected. I'm the one who won't get the kind of support that I need in order to survive. And the existential panic associated with that can feel just absolutely debilitating and overwhelming, because any of those things could just feel like death, right? And that sense of value evolves when we are growing up by our parents just attending to us, by giving us their time, by giving us their attention, by being present with us, because then we feel like we matter. when a parent is like, oh, go do something, I don't have time, or whatever, or even worse, every time we turn to them for some support or want to do something with them, or, could we go to a movie, or could we go on a picnic, or could we go out and play, or could we go do something? And then the parent is like, comes back at us like, I'm too busy. How dare you, go find your friend, blah, 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 and makes us feel, bad, or like, oh my God, I can't even do that. There is a part of us that starts to internalize this sense that we don't matter, and that there's something about us that must be flawed in some way, or something about us that is just not right. And the other one of those, the fifth one of those, is really the question of, can I affect the world around me? Will my efforts create some change, right? Can I affect my environment? Because if I can't, again, historically speaking, being in that very vulnerable place, if I am in a position where I am helpless, that would oftentimes just be a place where you're dead. Helpless would be in the center of a den of lions, right? Or helpless would be you're waist deep in quicksand, right? Helpless would be, you are cast overboard and you're flailing around in the ocean, right? I mean, those are the kinds of, that's kind of the existential panic that can exist in a child, where it's like, no matter what I try to do, it just doesn't seem to make any difference. It's like, whether I get good grades or bad grades, nobody cares. Whether I, any time that I like want to do something, that is actively undermined, or it can't. Kids start just developing this sense of, I just helplessness. I can't do anything, and that creates this really deep-seated sense of panic. And all five of these things are, when these things of identity, connection, safety, value, and agency, when these five things are undermined or are not developed or are injured in some way when we are a child, these are the things that have to be corrected. They have to be repaired in order for the pain to stop. These are the severed tendons. These are the broken bones, right? I mean, these are the big gashes in the skin. And unless these things are addressed and they are healed, and there's actually some repair that is done on these, they will continue to be sources of pain in our life. And in fact, I argue that these five things, these five areas of ourself, of identity, connection, safety, value, and agency, these questions of who am I? Am I alone? Had a little brain fart there for a second. Who am I? Am I alone? Am I safe? Do I matter? And can I affect the world around us, right? These are very, very primal parts of our self-concept. And when those are wounded, we will come into adulthood with pain that just remains around whichever of those has been wounded. In some people, it's all five, right? In some people, it's all five. And in some, it may only be one. In some, it may only be two. But most of the behavior, the self-destructive or behavior like people-pleasing or ADHD and all of those kinds of things that we experience, our mind's way, our soul's way of trying to seek repair for the things that have been wounded. For example, if we have our sense of value, the sense of do I matter, if that was wounded when we were growing up and wasn't adequately nourished, right? We will come into adulthood oftentimes seeking to have that repaired from people who really, it's not their job to make us, to repair that, right? So people-pleasing behavior in a lot of ways is this wounded sense of do I matter, this wounded sense of value, where we will go and we'll try to prove to other people that somehow we're awesome, and I just want you to get me to see what a great person I am. So I'll try to rescue you in the hopes, and kind of the unconscious hope, that you will turn to me and just go, wow, you know what? You are really an amazing person. You have no idea what a difference you made in my life. And when people who we go in and rescue, the bad boys, or the struggling puppies or whatever, right? The homeless puppies. When we go in and rescue, a lot of times that is really coming from a broken sense of value, that I need you to see me as being important. I need you to see me as being valuable. I need you to recognize that I have something worthwhile to offer. And so I may just give you my flesh. I may just go way overboard and do things that even undermine my own sense of well-being, just so that you feel better. And then, you see this a lot in dysfunctional relationships, right? Where, there's one person who will try to manage the emotional life of the other to make sure that they're okay, even at their own detriment. And that is oftentimes coming from this state of woundedness around this sense of self, this sense of value. The sense of safety thing is a very, very common thing where, people who have this damaged sense of safety through, and it could be in several forms of trauma, whether you felt trapped and overwhelmed, like you were assaulted or something like that, or that was undermined through deprivation, where when you needed support, when you were afraid, not only was it not there, but you might have been mocked for being afraid or for needing support. And so there's this part of you that will tend to see danger, right, where none may in fact exist. You may have trust issues. You may be very wary of, people's intentions. You may have a hard time just kind of relaxing and just being present with people because you always feel on guard. And interestingly, because, that kind of, any of those developmental injuries, right? It's not only that we tend to project into the environment this sense that people are unsafe or always looking for, warning signs or flags of danger, but there's also this kind of distortion in our lens where not only do we see danger where none exists, but we will oftentimes not see danger where it does exist. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of times people who have this woundedness around that sense of safety part of themselves will oftentimes find themselves in relationships where it's like, how did I not see the warning signs that this guy or this woman was very unhealthy? And yet once I got into they seemed fine. I had kind of this weird blind spot. And all of a sudden I'm in this relationship and this abuse is happening, or this person turned out to be way more toxic than I at first thought. And even my friends who are saying, oh man, I would stay away from that guy, or I'd stay away from that woman, you're just kind of like, no, they're seeing something, but we can't see it. And, the thing that we just talked about with value, the same thing is true there, right? I mean, we will tend to oftentimes seek validation and seek value and seek recognition from the very people who are the least able to provide it. And then we will tend to discard or not be able to recognize or internalize the messages and the signals and all of that we're getting from people who really do value us and want us to be in their orbit, right? They want to be our friends, and they may say things like, you're smart, you're beautiful, everybody loves you, or handsome, everybody really loves you. And when you have this broken sense of value, you're like, I hear you saying that, but it doesn't feel real to me, right? It doesn't feel real because when I hear those words and I compare with what I'm feeling on the inside, that's just not how I see myself, right? And the sense of identity thing, the who am I, when we have a damaged sense of identity, the biggest thing that we will oftentimes experience is just this struggle in life of like, who am I? Where do I belong? Where do I fit? I don't feel like I have like this clear sense of even who I am. And so we may be looking at others and trying to like approximate their behavior because it's like, well, they seem to be happy. They seem to kind of have something going on and have a direction. And it's like, maybe if I just, take on their personality a bit, then I'll have, I can at least borrow their sense of identity. And what you'll tend to see with that damaged sense of identity is that people can change pretty significantly in different contexts. And so where somebody with a well-formed sense of identity may show up different in a job interview versus like, at a party in Cancun, right? But their core sense of self is the same. There's almost like in different contexts, people who have a damaged sense of identity tend to lose themselves in those contexts and may just like become that environment. And oftentimes to some of the more extreme elements of that, it's like their entire identity starts to become wrapped up in that. And then when something doesn't go well there and they get into something else, now they become just be completely immersed into this new sense of being. And so what you'll tend to see in people who have a damaged sense of identity is that their life is a little bit more like a series of short stories, right? Rather than one long, epic journey. It's just like, it's marked by all of these different self-encapsulated pieces of their life that sometimes don't really even seem to have any continuity to them. And so the sense of agency, that's one where there's this idea of boundary, right? Where we can make a determination about what comes into our life and what doesn't come into our life, what kinds of behavior we're going to accept and what kinds of behavior we won't. This idea that if I do X, then I can expect that this will happen. And so if I put myself out there in the dating world, for example, I will meet a partner, I will be able to form a good partnership with somebody, and that'll be great, and we'll be successful in the relationship and all of those kinds of things. And when we have a damaged sense of that damaged sense of agency, that damaged sense of, can I affect my world? We have a very difficult time setting boundaries. We have a difficult time kind of standing up for ourselves. We have a difficult time making decisions and following through on them. We'll have a hard time planning and following through on the plan. I mean, we might plan. We might write down a calendar of everything we're going to do in the next 6 months. That totally seems to make sense in the moment. And boy, howdy, are we going to do that? And then by the next day, it's like it's out the window. Or within a couple days, it's like the whole thing is out the window, right? Because we have a difficult time organizing the events in our lives in a way that we can engage the world in an intentional way. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about all of that, because the really important point here, right, is that there are 5 parts of ourselves, right? Our identity, our sense of connection with others, our sense of safety, our sense of value, and our sense of agency, that are core needs that we all have. And when we are growing up, it is the responsibility of our caregivers to help us develop those parts of ourselves to be very robust and strong. And so we enter into adulthood with kind of a coherent sense of self. We may struggle, with a few things here and there, but by and large, we have a fairly coherent sense of self, right? We know who we are. We have a sense of belonging. We feel connected with the people around us. We have friends. We have acquaintances. We feel connected with family members and all of that. We feel safe. We view the world as being generally safe. We tend to trust people and all of that. We tend to feel like we have an inherent sense of dignity and that we are lovable and that people like us. And we will, kind of interact with the world based on that, that people will like us and we like people. And we'll also have a sense of agency that, I can do what I seek to do, right? I mean, there's some constraints on our, kind of our physical body. I mean, if we're 5'1", we probably won't be a professional basketball player, right? Or if we only weigh 110 pounds, we probably won't play in the NFL, right? But within some of those, guidelines, within some of those constraints, we can do whatever we choose to pursue, right? There's nothing that is stopping us from that. And that coherence of the sense of self is something that we tend to live with for the rest of our lives. Now, if we grew up in a home where there was we were deprived of the kind of interaction with our parents and our caregivers that would allow those areas of ourselves to develop, we will enter into adulthood with kind of much more of a struggle about who am I, feeling that like we don't matter, feeling disconnected and alone and all of those kinds of things. And a lot of our behavior in adulthood that we look back and it's like, why am I doing this, right? Why do I keep people pleasing, or why do I keep choosing the wrong partner, or why do I always feel so helpless? Why does nothing ever seem to work, right? All of the things that we do and all those behaviors and all of those thoughts that we're having are really attempts to repair those parts of ourselves that should have been developed in childhood, right? Now, if you grew up in an effigistic household or a narcissistic household or a sadistic household where your sense of self was not only neglected, but actively undermined and actively attacked, you could come into adulthood with a real significant struggle with just things feeling very disoriented and just really feeling almost this internal sense of collapse and failure and just awful, where there's just a lot of just negative self-talk that's been internalized from our experience in childhood. And, we will oftentimes reach out and do things, try to engage with people, and try to repair those parts of ourselves because they are painful. And remember, we talked about early on that one of the things that emotions do is they focus our attention, right? And pain focuses our attention. And so when we come into adulthood, where we have those damaged parts of ourselves, it's like our attention and everything just becomes so directed by these wounded parts of ourselves that it's oftentimes hard to just chill and just enjoy life and just hang out with people and feel like you belong and know who you are and all of these things, right? And instead, it's like our attention can be, there can be times when nothing is particularly triggered, when we just kind of shoved all that stuff to the side and we busy ourselves doing a lot of activities and trying to be successful or doing whatever we can in order to try to not feel that stuff. But whenever one of those things gets triggered, it can knock us right out of the driver's seat of our own life and take over. And now everything can again start feeling catastrophic, and we may start engaging in behaviors like undermining relationships or quitting jobs or doing a whole bunch of stuff. And all of that, in a very twisted way, is an attempt for a wounded part of ourself to find some sense of relief, to find some sense for healing. And once we understand that and we can interpret our behavior and some of the things that we do that we find so troubling through that lens, right? It's like, just because I'm people-pleasing doesn't mean that I'm a nut, right? It means that there is a part of me that is seeking repair from the very people who are unable to provide it. So instead, how do I, recognizing that, oh, you know what? I want to go rescue somebody right now. Therefore, I can, let me reframe that. And it's like, right now there is a wounded part of myself around around my sense of value, around do I matter, that is seeking some repair right now. And what is a healthier way that I can seek repair? Do I have a partner I can turn to? And just saying, right now I'm really struggling with a sense that I don't matter. Is there a friend? Is there a therapist? Do we belong to a community of people, right, where we can share some of that stuff and get some healthy validation and support? All right, folks, I'd like to take a few minutes to respond to some of your comments on the videos that you've been leaving on YouTube. I do read as many of those as I can. There are a lot of them, so if I don't get to yours, please understand that I am listening to your comments and questions, and not only using that to think about future episodes and what kinds of things you guys want to hear about or hear more about, but also to respond to some of those, because I think many of you are giving voice to an experience that is very common among people who grew up either in effigistic households or experienced some kind of emotional neglect or trauma. The first one comes from Jane, and she says, quote, "The more I learn, the more I understand why I needed to be the one seen as a failure. When someone looks at you in the face and says, 'No one will ever believe you,' the intention is unmistakable." When I read that, There was a little bit of a kind of visceral reaction to that, because one of the things that happens, particularly with effigism, you see this sometimes with narcissism as well, but in effigism in particular, this is a real issue, where not only does somebody undermine your sense of self until you are in this state of failure where you just internalize this belief that, oh my God, I'm bad, I can't do anything right, I'm unlovable, there's something about me that is just innately broken, there's something about me that is just different from everybody else. Everybody else seems to be okay, and everybody else seems to have this kind of natural intuitive sense on how to connect with others and engage the world and be happy and successful, but I don't. There's something unique about me that just doesn't quite seem to be able to get in gear in certain areas of my life. And sometimes, depending on the severity of the effigism, sometimes in any part of your life, sometimes the experience of being the proxy, being the target of an effigist can be so completely demoralizing and so completely undermining of our sense of self that we're just kind of in this, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I'm going, I don't feel like I can do anything, I feel unlovable, I feel broken, I try to put on a happy face and I try to do what people expect me to do in the hopes that either somebody will recognize me as being valuable or being a good person, or at least not being able to see what a horrible person I actually am. And what makes the pattern of effigism even more bothersome or even more problematic is that the effigist will oftentimes go to other people around you in your support system, your neighbors, your friends, your other members of the family, and they're just like, well, you know how she is, or you know how he is. He can't seem to ever get his crap together. She can't ever seem to get her crap together. And so now everyone else also sees you as being the failure and treats you that way. Instead of treating you like somebody who is, maybe struggling but is up and coming and doing things great, there is almost like a kind of a sympathetic and patronizing tone that they oftentimes take, where, even little backhanded comments like, well, I know that things like this are hard, or I know it's hard for you to follow through with things, and all of that. And it's just like, oh, those just serve to further undermine your own sense of self, when in fact none of it is true. But for the effigist, they need to get us to believe it's true, right? It's like the baby elephant that's tied to a tree, right? And they pull and they pull and they pull, and soon they just learn, I'm never going to be able to pull this rope. I'm never going to be able to pull myself free of this rope. And then as an adult, you can put a little rope around them and tie them around a small tree that they would be able to pull out in a heartbeat. But because they just have this internalized sense of, oh, what's the use? That's just me. This is just the reality. We really start internalizing a dialogue of failure, right? And when we grow up where everyone even around us now views us through that lens of being a failure, there's like no way out, right? There's no one we can turn to that doesn't already kind of have us placed in that. And that's one of the things that is just super, super destructive about that, about the whole effigistic the whole effigistic pattern. So John said, my mother discouraged every goal and was disgusted when I reached out for counseling. At 34, after one counseling session, I moved out of the family home and got my own place. It was one of the best decisions of my life. I finally experienced peace. I am now 69. You know, it's one of the things that I will oftentimes see is that there's just a general failure to launch in a lot of people who grow up in an effigistic home. There are some who will join the military, or they might start a business and do well, but they're, as far as being able to support themselves, but there's part of kind of being a differentiated and actualized adult that just never really seems to quite develop when we grow up in that kind of effigistic home. And so what we might find is that, if we're able to get into a marriage, it will oftentimes be a very unhealthy one, or we will struggle to form relationships at all. We may struggle to be able to support ourselves without the family's help. I mean, my own uncle, after 3 failed marriages, he was in probably his 50s at the time, had to move back in with his mom, my grandmother. And there was just this sense in my uncle of just this kind of failure, right? That just like everything I tried just never works out. And there's just this sense of hopelessness and this sense of helplessness that oftentimes comes. And it sounds like, for this gentleman, going to a counseling session at 34 and getting some recognition about how unhealthy that dynamic was. And then he was like, just put down a boundary and said, I'm done. No more of this. I am just not going to participate in this anymore. And I'm going to get my own place. And instead of the parent being, thank God, at 34, please, right? Get out of there, get out of here and go establish your life. Go conquer the world, do what you're meant to do, And instead, there was this criticism and being disgusted and all of those kinds of things. And that is just, it's so painful when you are the target of that kind of stuff, because we are wired, even though we may pretend like we don't care what anybody says. It's nonsense. Of course we do. We're wired to care. It's important for us, no matter what age we are, to have some validation and have some recognition and to receive encouragement from our parents, right? I mean, that's how we're wired. That's how we're wired. Now, some of us have had to cut those and kind of let some scar tissue heal over our relationship, emotional engagement with our parents, just because that experience has been so harmful. But we always have that need. And it was interesting that even at 34, when a parent should have been really encouraging and excited for him that he went to counseling, he's looks like he's trying to really make some positive changes in his life and move out and do some positive things, that instead of celebrating that, there was more of an undermine. By the way, these are the first time I'm reading a lot of these. So if I stumble a little bit, please have some patience with me. This is from John. I needed this exact video to confirm my suspicions. You may have helped save my life, because I have been physically breaking down and the treatment has worsened as I try to get help. I am separating from my spouse and taking one child to protect us. Now I have something that helps me explain the pain. So I don't know your situation, your particular situation, but I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for that acknowledgement. I think one of the things that a lot of us needed is just to have a framework, have a term, have a conceptual framework to make sense out of our experience, right? Because if we can't, if there's no way to really understand what has happened to us, the only conclusion that we can really draw is that it must be me, right? There must be something just inherently flawed with me, right? That everybody else seems to be able to get their crap together but me. And, hearing about narcissism or hearing about emotionally immature parents and all of these other kinds of things, for those of us who grew up in an effigistic home, you're kind of like, yeah, I can kind of see elements there. Yeah, I can kind of see elements there. But there's a certain type of targeted cruelty or targeted undermining that none of those other things seem to really explain. And so once we actually have a term, once we actually have the concept of effigism and that framework to make sense out of why is it that somebody is undermining me, and what is really going on, and why am I feeling this way, then all of a sudden it's like we have some clarity around things, and that allows us to move forward. I'm sorry to hear that treatment hasn't worked well for you, and I'm not sure what you're doing for treatment, or whether it's kind of an inpatient thing that you're referring to, or whether you're going to a therapist and the therapist doesn't really understand a lot about emotional trauma, doesn't understand much about narcissism or emotionally immature parents, and certainly very few people understand about effigism, right? But sometimes sometimes therapists can be very helpful, and sometimes they can be more hurtful than helpful. And unfortunately, when a therapist doesn't really understand emotional trauma, they don't really understand a lot of the dynamics that go on in families where somebody can be really wounded. A lot of times their approaches can be can feel pretty dismissive and, kind of blaming, and like, well, all you need to do is just challenge your negative beliefs, or let's just take a thought inventory and see if we can replace those with healthier thoughts. And, it's like, dude, if it was that easy, I would have done this a long time ago, right? But that just shows me that you don't really understand what is happening here. Instead, you learn some techniques that may be appropriate for some people and may help some people a lot. But for somebody who has been the target of effigism, you need to have a therapist that really has not only kind of a book learning around trauma and dealing with trauma, but they've lived through it themselves. Because there's a certain level of understanding, and there's a certain level of, oh man, I get it. And here's what was helpful for me to hear when I was in your place. And so this is what I'm going to share with you. And when somebody hasn't had those experiences, but instead, they go through grad school, and I can tell you that when you come out of grad school, you have a lot of book knowledge, but not a whole lot of real experience in how to understand and deal with clients who have really been through a lot in their lives. And unless you have been through a lot in your life, it can be pretty tough to really even know how to make sense out of what somebody is experiencing or why they do dumb things, right? And the phenomenon that happens a lot of times in people who have been the target of effigism, and this is also true with kind of any form of emotional trauma. Effigism is a unique form of emotional trauma, right? It's just kind of a unique constellation of injury that is different than the injuries that you get from a narcissistic or just emotional neglect. There are certain types of things that we will tend to struggle with, or we will tend to, say, or things that we will do that to the outside observer may not make a whole lot of sense. And just saying, well, just make better decisions is not necessarily helpful. So again, I don't know your particular situation and what kind of treatment you're in or what about that has been unhelpful. But if you are looking for a therapist, one of the things that I would look for, in order for your own healing, one of the things that I would look for is how much have you actually had to overcome yourself? Not getting asked to the prom probably doesn't rise to the level of trauma. Growing up in a family where there was addiction and having to overcome a lot of that kind of stuff, or having experienced abuse or whatever it is, neglect. Growing up in a narcissistic or an effigistic household and having to work through a lot of those things yourself, prior to going into grad school to become a therapist, those are the kind of people who will tend to, not all, right, but will tend to be a bit more effective in working with folks who have had some emotional damage. Well, that's it for today's episode. And if you found this helpful, I would like to ask you a favor. Would you please just hit the subscribe button, hit the like, and also share this with anybody who you think might benefit from it. Every subscriber helps communicate to YouTube that this is good information, and then YouTube just shows it to more people. So I really appreciate your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.